Welcome to the Altered Call podcast. The things that you believe matter, but only when they have a real impact on the world. What happens when a belief is so strong that it shapes your perception of everything else? What happens when it shapes your perception of God? My name is Pillischafske. I believe that the One Piece is real. I believe that Santa is a government conspiracy, and I believe that you are uniquely created to reflect God's glory in the world. Today I want to talk about how we perceive the world. In the Tools episode, I defined a lens as a way of looking at something that is contrary to either how you would normally perceive it or in a different way than it is intended to be viewed. This might seem like something that doesn't happen that often, but in reality we do it almost constantly. The most commonly known version of this idea is what we call the suspension of disbelief, often associated with entertainment. When we watch a movie, we know fully well that everything that we are observing is fabricated. And yet when we watch a quality movie, we are willing to submit our perception to the idea that everything that we are experiencing is in some sense real. Without this lens, it would be impossible to immerse ourselves enough in the story for us to understand the emotions and experiences that the director intends to convey through the medium. We willingly allow ourselves to be fooled in order to experience something that we deem to have higher value. In this case, the opportunity to enjoy the movie. This becomes evident when we are forced to watch a movie that we do not enjoy. In those instances, we aren't willing to fool ourselves to the extent that we can be immersed in the film because we no longer assign enough value to the experience to undergo the deception. The use of lenses isn't limited to entertainment. It is nearly universal that people extend more trust and influence to people that they know. We all believe that our children are in some way cuter, smarter, or better behaved than we would perceive anyone else's child of similar quality. We like to pretend that candy is anything other than raw poison as we gleefully consume it. We like to make good first impressions so that we can help people to view us through a more favorable lens than they would be tempted into had we not put in the extra effort. Every single one of these lenses is a small self-deception that we use to streamline how we interact with the world. This shorthand is a simplification of our beliefs crystallized into a tool that we use, consciously or subconsciously, to evaluate everything around us. A lens is our brain's attempt to prioritize what we find valuable and ignore the things that we don't within the confines of a certain scenario. When it comes to the movie, you desire to be entertained, so your brain simply ignores all of the logical fallacies that might prevent that entertainment. When it comes to our kids, it generally benefits us more to like our kids than to like the kids of other people, so our brain interprets them in a more positive light. Candy tastes good, so at the moment of consumption we pretend that nutrition doesn't exist. We're forced to interact with the people in our world, so it is easier to think that they are more competent and trustworthy than they are, because to believe otherwise might force us to confront any deficiencies in our immediate surroundings. I spend a lot of time wrestling with what I believe and the hierarchy that emerges from weighing and engaging with those beliefs. Eventually in the process, I find that a belief or system of beliefs has converted itself to a lens. The question that I always ask myself is this: does this lens improve my life in any meaningful way? And what potential cost is associated with the self-deception that ensues? The reason that the suspension of disbelief is so prevalent is because, as a general rule, movies are enjoyable, and the cost of submitting your mind to the film is often perceived as negligible. As such, we all do it. When it comes to lenses that interact with the real world, things become much more complex. As we discussed in the Ecclesiastes episode, the underlying mechanics of the world are very hard to perceive. If something good happens, did you get lucky? Did you earn it? Is it divine intervention? Some of each? Who knows? When something bad happens, you are presented with the same options. Again, who knows what the reality is? That said, what is your lens? You get the option to perceive the result to be any or all of those things. Which one do you choose? What is the cost associated with choosing the wrong one? If you assign value in the wrong place, you run the risk of coming to the wrong conclusion. Probably the most valuable aspect of acquiring wisdom and experience is the ability to rightly perceive the world around you and come to meaningful conclusions accordingly. Inconsistent or unreliable feedback loops can be very difficult to navigate, So a life lived with a misguided lens can lead to misery and defeat, while consistent and reliable feedback often leads to mastery and success. Proverbs 4:7 says this, "The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom." And then it says some other stuff. But that sounds an awful lot like, if you want to become rich, go get money. Instead, I'm tempted to believe that this passage is pointing out the cyclical nature of wisdom. If you are wise, you will be drawn more naturally to the right conclusions. Those right conclusions will make you wiser, and the cycle will repeat endlessly so long as your wisdom persists. Now, the more astute listeners are probably starting to wonder where this exploration is headed. Is he actually going to ask us to intentionally deceive ourselves by adapting a lens that is more generous towards God? Yes. Yes, I am going to do that. I've been writing for a while, and I can't seem to find another logical direction for this episode to go. So let's jump straight to the meat of the question. If I did make that argument, would it be bad? Your perceptions of the world dictate your experience of the world. One of the things that drives me crazy about my wife is her inability to distinguish between the quality of something once it has crossed a certain threshold. Going back to movies, she has exactly two categories, good and bad, and something needs to be utter trash for her to be willing to put it into the bad category. As such, her feedback on most things is, "I thought it was good." It drives me insane because some of the greatest movies ever are forced to share space with movies that I hate, all safely tucked away under the umbrella of good. Now, I don't believe that it's a lack of discernment on her part, simply an unwillingness to distinguish between the things that she deems sufficient. On the other side of things, one of my favorite aspects of my wife is her insane level of contentment. Circumstances that would drive me crazy are all just fine. As a general rule, she will tolerate most things and isn't prone to having anything resembling an existential crisis. It's all just fine. Somehow this lens, dictating that 90% of everything is good, has allowed her to be hyper-tolerant of the world and have very few critiques or complaints accordingly. So how accurately does her lens perceive reality? It doesn't matter. The end result is that she is extremely happy living her life, and it just so happens that she is married to someone that is well equipped to keep at bay everything bad that might slip past her defenses. I love fighting those battles on behalf of my family, and she trusts me to do it. Were she single or married to someone else, this lens might put her in a very vulnerable position. But given her reality, the cost associated with this lens is very low in real terms. So how do we craft a lens that allows us to see the world in a more God-centered way without exposing ourselves to undue cost? I think that a large portion of this comes from admitting at a very deep level that we just don't know. One of the main takeaways from Ecclesiastes is the idea that only God gets to know what is truly good or bad in the world. He also is the only one that knows how the world itself is created to operate. So any lens that we build incorporating God needs to be flexible in nature. Now, I tend to believe that the world is something like 60% results dependent, 30% luck, and 10% God doing stuff in the background. But is that correct? No, it is not correct. But I have enough flexibility in my beliefs that I can use this as a baseline and deviate from there. So let's look at how this lens encourages me to engage with the world. We start with 60% cause and effect. This means that I primarily deem my results to be a byproduct of how I interact with the world. This view encourages me to do my best in situations that I can control, but acknowledges that personal effort will only go so far. 30% luck speaks to a large but not overwhelming impact on my life from forces that I either can't control or even necessarily understand. This allows me to accept that not every negative result is directly tied to performance, and not every positive outcome is necessarily fully deserved. Finally, 10% God allows me to see His hand as potentially being involved in any particular outcome without negating my responsibility. If God could be involved in any positive outcome, then it is appropriate to thank Him for any positive outcome. And if he could be involved in any negative outcome, then it is appropriate to wonder how that negative outcome might contribute to his desires somewhere down the road. I know that these percentages are wrong. Maybe the entire framework is wrong. But you can't get around the idea that everyone has a lens that they use to explain the world, and to one degree or another, every single one of them is wrong. How do I know? Because anyone that rightly understood the world would be God. I believe that God created a world that is both predictable and uncertain. Wisdom allows you to perceive the world with increasing clarity, but to understand any one thing, you would be forced to understand every other thing that impacts its trajectory over time. That is to say, you would need to understand it all. Now I want to turn this episode around. Maybe you've never considered having a lens that you use to view the world, but you have one. Everything that you have ever viewed or processed has been through a series of lenses that you use to understand the chaos and uncertainty of the world. Over time, these stories become so much a part of you that unchecked, they can become the driving force in your life. Call it limiting beliefs, foolish behavior, or a lack of faith. I'd argue that you can see each of these plainly in someone else. But what about you? When something happens that you can't explain, what do you choose to believe? What story reaches out to fill that gap? Lately, I've been attempting to solve the problem of taking men from where they find themselves to a place of radical faith, and I've been feeling a little stuck in that exploration. Yesterday, I felt an overwhelming desire to rewatch a couple of YouTube videos that I really enjoy. They are a series of video essays regarding professional wrestling, so my initial temptation was to consider it a waste of time. But two things caused me to reconsider. The first is that the meta-considerations of wrestling, the way that it is perceived and engaged with more than the medium itself, is an idea that has engrossed me for a very long time. The second is that I choose to live in a world where God is an active participant in my life, occasionally directing my attention to where it needs to be. So I started watching the videos. Several hours later, I had a starting point for this episode, and enough ideas to fill several more pointing men towards a place of radical faith. Had this exploration resulted in nothing, I would have considered it a random detour, as my lens allows plenty of room for my own misunderstandings. But it didn't. As it happened, I believe that it was God starting me down a road of useful thoughts that I could leverage towards my goals. I've been living my life with these types of open questions and explorations for a long time now, and certain interventions seem more worthy of pursuit than others. But by starting each exchange with the question of, is this a God thing? I keep him front and center in my attention and give him the maximum amount of opportunity to get the credit. Is this lens universally correct, or even correct generally? No, but it puts my attention exactly where I want it to be. So what is the cost? The cost is an episode like this, where I passionately discuss an idea that could easily be misinterpreted. The cost is being judged by people that have no real explanation of how God interacts with the world, but are simultaneously willing to tell me that my open-handed understanding is wrong. Being weird and being misunderstood is the cost of this particular lens. Living in a world where God is alive requires high degrees of discernment and generates considerable doubt as you go. But it is a world where I can see the very best in people. A world where I can think that God is hilarious because of how he gets my attention, and a world where I truly believe that everything will be okay. I'll be the first to admit that I don't know how any of this works. But that's the joke. Neither does anyone else. I've explained how I choose to see the world. What does your world look like?